Welcome, everyone, to the University of Alaska Anchorage ANCSA at 50 celebration. My name is William L. Iraruk Hensley. I come from a village called Kirtaruk, about to be an island, otherwise known as Kotzebue. Kotzebue is named for a Dane who happened to come by there in 1815 on a global trip on behalf of the Russians. And my parents are John and Priscilla Hensley, Akbayuk and Nonoharat, and our family lived in the Kotzebue area in another age. It was still the sod house era and the dog team era that I grew up in there, in the Kotzebue and the Little Noatak area. I'd like to thank the Chancellor and the University of Alaska and their staff for this opportunity to commemorate one of the most significant acts of Congress relating to Alaska, and especially to the indigenous people that occupied Alaska. And there's simply no other legislation in American history that is as unique as the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act in the annals of Native American history, in my opinion. It broke all the precedents as we tried to find avenues to enable the state of Alaska, the combined tribes of Alaska, and the federal government to find a way forward on a very complicated situation. This question of who owned Alaska literally had gone unresolved for over 100 years since the transfer of Russia's interest in 1867. Most of us involved in this issue absolutely had the most minimal understanding of Alaskan history, of our own people, of the Russian era, or of the early American era. So we were actually a blank slate. And we didn't realize that the Russians were, in the 125 or so years they were here, they barely numbered 700 people. And we perhaps had in the range of 70,000 or so. In any case, I think the Russians realized that they couldn't protect Alaska. When they got involved in the Crimean War, there was literally no way they could protect their interests in Alaska. And they decided to sell their interest to the United States for $7.2 million, which I believe is in the neighborhood of $120 million. And so they left Alaska. And the US flag rose in Alaska. We had new overlords, so to speak. And the reality is that we were not citizens of the United States really until 1924. So prior to that time, we could not vote, we could not own property, we could not own mining claims in our own territories. And that was resolved when we became citizens. And the next huge issue came, of course, in 1959. Congress allowed us to form tribes in 1936 with an amendment to the Indian Reorganization Act. So that's the basis of our tribes here in Alaska. But the growth of the population during World War II enabled Alaskans to petition Congress for statehood. And that came in the Eisenhower administration in 1959. The sad reality for Alaska Native people is that essentially the Congress was attempting to grant away over 100 million acres of land that we claimed was ours for no compensation. And that was something that I was just a high schooler at the time, so we had no idea what was happening. I just happened to be in Fairbanks on the day the bill passed the Senate, the summer of 1958. And so I joined the celebration, not knowing really what was in that legislation, that our land was in jeopardy. In any case, as the state began to file for the land that it was promised. They began to select lands around villages, particularly in the rail belt area, and they became quite agitated because they never really understood what was about to happen as a consequence of the Statehood Act. And so when I was a college student at George Washington, I used to go to the Library of Congress. I was lonesome for Alaska news. And I would go there and I'd read old Alaska newspapers. And I would see an occasional article where villagers were complaining that the state was trying to take their land. So, but I had no idea, what really the legal issues and the historical issues were. And then upon returning to Alaska, I had the good fortune of going to Fairbanks, to the university there. We had only one campus at the time. And Jay Rabinowitz was a member of the state Supreme Court, and he was teaching a course in constitutional law. And just by chance, I chose to take that course. And for the first time, I really understood the nature of the issue. Going back to the treaty era between the United States and American Indian tribes, I looked at the Treaty of Cession, the Organic Acts, the Indian Reorganization Act, the Indian Allotment Act, and all the way to the Statehood Act. And it struck me as I tried to think as an attorney that I realized that our underlying Indian title had never been extinguished through all of that legislation. But I realized that the moment the state chose an area for an interim conveyance by the secretary, once that was signed, we would, if we even had a chance to get the land back, we were never going to get it back. So that kind of turned me into a little bit of a militant, because I realized that we were all in jeopardy from one end of the state to the other. All the villages were in jeopardy of losing their lands. And so I started with my region. I borrowed $10 from a guy named Harry Punnick to buy stamps. And two of my classmates helped me write a letter where I took everything I gleaned in that course and condensed it into 4 pages. And I sent that to our villages. And that precipitated what has become Nana Regional Corporation now. And stories like this happened all over Alaska. And then, of course, what precipitated even more of a concern was the discovery of billions of barrels of oil at Prudhoe Bay in 1968. So that ratcheted up this whole question of what are the indigenous rights to land in Alaska. Excuse me. And so Wally Hickel was the first governor to face the question of who owned Alaska in a sense. And the issue became even more of an issue when Stuart Udall, Secretary of Interior, decided not to process state requests for land under the Statehood Act because he was a trustee for Native American lands, reservations, rancherias, allotments, restricted deed town sites. And I think he realized that as a trustee, he may be trampling on indigenous rights. And so he quit processing, his department quit processing state selections. And of course, Governor Hickel fought that tooth and tongue because Alaska was financially very, very weak. And to me, it was questionable whether Alaska could survive as a state back then. And so he fought the freeze tooth and tongue, and of course, politically and legally. But what happened, of course, in 1968 was the election of Richard Nixon. And all of a sudden, our enemy on the land freeze was going to become the caretaker of Native American lands when Wally Hickel was chosen by President Nixon as the new Secretary of Interior. And so that ratcheted up our concern because we, in the Native community, having no experience whatsoever in issues of this nature, initially had no lawyers, we had no money, We had no telephones. It was all post office. We sensed that if the pipeline became a reality, that we were going to be forgotten. And so we made it a priority, try to hang on to that land freeze. And I have a photograph of myself sitting in Stuart Udall's office just days before he was out of office, when he actually withdrew all of Alaska under a little used federal law and created what was called a super freeze. So that basically stopped the potential construction of the pipeline and gave Congress an opportunity to resolve the issue. And that was sort of like the lay of the land. The Alaska Federation of Natives had virtually no income. We ended up borrowing money from the Tyonics, from the Yakima tribe, Tlingit and Haida. And we were so ignorant, we didn't realize that the idea of trying to get land conveyed back to Native people on the scale we were talking about had never happened. But we doggedly went forward, and the pieces came into place to allow Congress to pass the act. And I think it's just a phenomenal saga. And that passage of that law revolutionized the land tenure here in Alaska, especially when followed by what's called ANILCA, the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, 10 years later under President Carter. And so we would literally have just a minuscule amount of private land in Alaska had we not gotten this act passed. And sometimes I wonder if we had been able to work with the pioneer types, the Alaskan business types, and had they not seen us as the enemy, we might have been able to secure more land for Alaskans. But that's my introduction to this great saga that, in my opinion, it had a great ending in that we appeal to the positive nature of the United States to treat us fairly. And there may be others who think it was unfair. And, if you own the whole shebang, yes, it was unfair. But the reality is that Alaska Natives are the largest landholders in the United States. I think that's remarkable. So we have one of the players in this game. There are many heroes, and we'd like to hear from Congressman Don Young, who we were reminiscing here. The Chancellor and I both ran against my good friend Don Young, and he's still there battling for us. Congressman Young.
This is Congressman Don Young, and thank you for thanking the University of Alaska for inviting me to be on the panel. I can't be there in person, as you know, but my main job here is to, very frankly, recognize my good friend Willie Hensley, part of the Native Land Claims Act, opponent of mine, good friend, Uncle Willie, of all people, my kids used to call him that, a good leader. A man has done a good job for the state of Alaska. I did beat you, Willie, but thank you. It's been fun. We repeating ourselves as friends, so very, very important. And we have Chancellor Sean Purnell. And Sean, we're my opponent too. This is ironic. But you're a great Alaskan. You've done well, and you would be a great chancellor for the University of Alaska. Big support of the university. Met with the president the other day. Continue to support it, and I hope that the people of Alaska recognize that their contribution, the university itself, is great for the state of Alaska. And we're going to talk about one of the most important pieces of legislation that's ever been passed by this Congress that benefits a nation and a group of people. That's the Alaska Native Land Claims Act. I was involved in it, not in Congress. I was done with Ted Stevens and Nick Begich and I believe at that time Mike Gravel. It was an issue that was somewhat divisive, but when you think about it, for the first time in history, the Congress is going to give a group of Aboriginal people 44 million acres of land and $1 billion. They put a lot of requirements in it. I've often said the bill was passed not thinking it would fail. And you think about having to set up corporations, nonprofit, profit, village corporations, nonprofit, profit, enrollment, which was amazing to me, the fact that enrollment itself took place and how many people become Alaska Native relatively quickly. And I say this sincerely. And they, I think, as they wrote it, didn't think it would work, but it was necessary to do so because of the need for the petroleum was in Alaska. So it passed. And I've been so proud of the ANCSA group, the corporations, the villages, the Alaska Natives, and what they've been able to do. Some failures, yes, but a lot of successes. And now it's probably the greatest success story, I think, in Alaska for the economic benefit and for the advancement of Aboriginal people, the First Americans. It's working. Now, there's some people that say it could have been better. It's always hindsight. It's sort of like watching a football game, and if they'd thrown it past, they would have won the Super Bowl. Instead of running it, was the other way around. If you remember Seattle, if they'd ran it, they'd probably been the Super Bowl champions. And this is the problem I'm trying to straighten it. There is a great success story here. The land utilization, retaining of the culture, recognition and improvement of, very frankly, advancement of the young people in the Native community has been tremendous because of this act legislation. 50 years goes pretty fast. This is the time I've been serving you, and I wasn't involved in it this past year before I got here. But having said that, we've worked on legislation at the behest of the Alaska Natives to try to improve it. The 91 Act, people forget that. I think was crucially important to maintain the strength of the whole act, and that was the 44 million acres of land. Under the original act, by 91, they could start selling their land. That was decided that the Native did not want to do that, and so we made that land sacred, and it's worked well to take the strength and keep the strength of the Alaska Native Land Claims Act. So I'm proud of this act. I'm proud of the Alaska Natives. I'm proud of being able to work with them, improve upon the act itself, but retain the concept, the greatest settlement in the Congress, in the history of the United States Congress. Frankly, I'm proud to be part of this program. Take care. This has been Congressman Don Young.
Thank you, Don Young. It's amazing, he's still there. And he's, it's amazing, really. Everything that has to pass the Senate also has to pass the House, and Don has been able to deliver on some monumental, pieces of legislation, and it's a credit to his capabilities as a congressman. Okay. We are supposed to move into a discussion of ANCSA, past and future. And if you want, I can, continue my dialogue a little bit to give you some background from my perspective. And of course, I've been teaching here at the university now for 10 years, and I know they didn't ask me to teach because they thought I was going to deliver the pioneer perspective, of Alaska, and so, and I have learned a lot. Back in those days, we simply had no time. I mean, you have to remember that all of this took place in this concentrated 5-year period, and most of us were wet behind the ears, had no depth of living experience, no historical, legal, or political experience. And here we were engaged in one of the most gigantic battles, that had to be faced. And I still maintain it's a virtual miracle that it came together. And so I appreciate the opportunity to give sort of the indigenous side of the story. And mind you, we always tried to understand, of course, the sort of what I might call the pioneer perspective, and it's completely different, and when you look at Alaska, if you look at the Constitutional Convention, it was as if we didn't exist, right? the only person who tried to do something for Alaska Natives with regard to land was a fellow by the name of Colonel Muktuk, M.R. Muktuk Marston. You know, and Muktuk was a term that Inupiat gave him. It's a delicacy. It's the skin of the bowhead whale, you know, with some blubber. They call him Muktuk Marston. But he was charged with organizing the Alaska Territorial Guard. So in spite of the fact that we weren't citizens till 24, that we weren't allowed to vote, there was discriminatory laws on the books, no natives need apply, things like that. Our people responded, and they became like a fighting force on behalf of the United States against the Japanese invasion, you know, which they did invade Attu. And but Muktuk Marston was recommending 160 acres for Alaska Native people, but they essentially ignored him. And so this is a saga where we were pragmatic. I mean, those of us who got engaged in the battle, you know, we were not flag wavers. You know, we weren't demonstrators. We worked hard to try to find realistic approaches that we could live with, that the non-native world could live with. And we started out, it was all about the land, because the land was so much a part of identity of all the different cultures up here. After thousands of years of occupancy, it really was built into your DNA. And the connection is virtually spiritual, you know, thousands upon thousands of years of our people buried in the earth. And there was never a focus on money. When we started, it was never about money, and for sure, never about corporations. And we knew there was a historic remedy for lands taken that the United States had set up. But we realized that the court of claims process was really stacked against the Indians, you know, because, you know, you had to spend a lot of money just to get the right to sue the country. And then you had to spend many, many years in court trying to prove that it was an illegal taking. And then when they paid you, it was based on the time of the taking, which could have been 100 years before. And so when I realized that the Clinton Haida spent 35 years trying to get compensation, they only got $7.5 million and not a square inch of land. And so in my simple mind as a student, I thought, that's not fair. And so we focus hard on land, but we realized that Alaska politicians, newspaper leaders, other business people, they wanted the land, and we knew that. We knew it was going to be a hard-fought battle. They wanted our resources. And so we tried to find out, how can we possibly lure Alaska and Alaskans into helping us get land? And as it turns out, Wally Hickel was elected a Republican, beating Governor Egan by a few hundred votes in 1966. And at that point, we had formed the Alaska Federation of Natives with virtually no money. It was a one come all type. You know, it was very ill suited for representing different groups, but you know, it was a big tent, and so we had many different interests. And we realized that there were two things that could kill legislation. Number one, if the state was not a player, and number two, if the natives were divided. That's a deal killer, right? There's going to be no legislation unless the state was a party. And so I have to compliment Governor Hickel, because he realized and we had no money to get together to even come out with a plan. or to do a study, and we had no time for studies, right? And so Governor Hickel, we agreed to let him form the Rural Affairs Commission so he could spend state money on us. We put the whole AFN board on it, and they created a drafting committee, which I chaired. And our job was to come up with ideas to give to the governor and to the state on how to move forward. And this little report here is very small because it's the size of the House of Representatives record we kept. And we worked diligently for several weeks. The drafting committee consisted of myself, Johnny Sackett from Uslia, representative, Julia Pixon from the Arctic Slope, John Borbridge from Juneau. And we worked, it was the closest thing to a tripartite effort where we represented the Native community. Governor Hickel had his Attorney General, or Edgar Paul Boyko, who was his special counsel there. And there was a Deputy Secretary from Interior, Robert Vaughn, at all the meetings. And so we came up with this little report, which I believe, in retrospect, sort of helped set the stage for the state coming on board. And it also changed the attitude of the press that here was a way forward. Now, if we had come up to Uncle Wally and said we wanted 200 reservations, that was a deal killer. But when we came up with the idea of 40 million acres in fee simple with Native controlled corporations organized under state law, with the state providing an overriding royalty to help pay for it, these ideas actually emerged 2 years later in the final legislation, among others. And so this is not well known. A lot of people forget about it but I think that these recommendations help pave the way to get the state on board. On the other side, we had a struggle trying to hold everybody together in the Alaska Federation Natives, because we had recognized tribes like Clink and Haida with lots of people, but they already had a settlement. We had villages represented. We had regional nonprofits like Northwest Alaska Native Association, Arctic Slope Native Association. We had urban groups like Fairbanks Native Association, Cook Inlet Native Association. So holding this group together was a real challenge. We did it because we accommodated the Southeasterners. It was a battle. We did it by coming up with a land formula that allowed smaller populated groups to get more land. We also came up with the 7I revenue sharing provision that has been very, very key to helping keep village corporations and other regional corporations going from subsurface income, like from Red Dog and other ventures. So those were the things that we had to do to move this whole possibility of legislation together. Now, the ones that played key roles, of course, there are many, both on the native side, but on the sort of the pioneer side. Governor Hickel, actually, I have more respect in thinking about him because we fought him tooth and tongue over the land freeze, but he was pragmatic. Like I said, he was the first elected official to support the 40 million acres before he became secretary. And he bought into the idea of revenue sharing, that is revenue sharing by the state, and he bought into this notion of the corporation as a vehicle rather than the traditional, tribal secretary control of the land sort of situation, okay? And so, but the thing, one other thing that we had to fight though, was there was a giant report contracted by the Senate Interior Committee, Chairman Jackson, to the Federal Field Committee, which was an Alaskan-based group that was designed to help Anchorage in Alaska recover from the earthquake in '64. And they did the first analysis of the whole issue in 100 years. There was not a single Native perspective in that group, and I knew them all. They were my friends, right? Bob Arnold, Esther Waneke, David Hickok, Doug Jones. The sad part of it is that their whole idea was to end up with literally no Native institution. They were going to have a federally appointed board handle the land, the money, They were going to issue stock to natives willy-nilly, no matter which tribe you're from. And in 10 years, it was going to go public. It was, in my mind, a sort of a colonial approach where they saw our villages as racial enclaves, and they wanted to see those differences erased, in my opinion. And so we had to fight that notion. We had to fight to get our village corporations and regional corporations. But on the secretarial side, on the BIA side, they were pretty much stuck in that mold that they were in of tribal reservations and tribes, secretarial control. And on top of that, their idea of a generous settlement was $180 million and only 10 million acres of land. The good thing about the Federal Field Committee was that they're the ones that came up with $1 billion, right? And they did a good job of land uses. But we had to push them up. And that was a struggle. But thank goodness we had this guy, Richard Nixon, in office. And back in those days, I never would have thought that he would be a hero to me. My hometown was sort of colonized by Quakers from Whittier, California, where he was from. Yeah, isn't that something?
Yeah.
And I still don't know if it's true that one of his heroes was an Indian by the name of
Coach Newman.
Wallace Newman.
Coach Newman. Yep.
And he respected him almost as much as his father because he was fair, and he taught Nixon to stand up and fight and keep fighting and don't give up. I guess this maybe was on the football field. I don't know. So I don't know if that's what motivated the president, but we were just lucky to have him there. And of course, on the Alaskan side, besides Governor Hickel, Senator Greening was a senator who had been territorial governor. He was a statesman. He was a powerful U.S. senator. He was an author, a Harvard graduate, but he did not believe in native holding land. I think as territorial governor, when the Secretary of Interior created the 1.5 million acre Venati Reserve, I think it angered him. And he and Bob Atwood, who is the head of the biggest newspaper in Alaska, were sort of in tune. And I sensed that as a kid when I had finished my paper in Fairbanks, my research paper on who owned Alaska. And I had actually a meeting with Senator Greening, and I sensed right away that he was not with us, and he had done nothing as territorial politician to help us. So when Mike Gravel was elected, he may not know it, bless his soul, but I think he prevented Senator Greening and the Federal Field Committee and Chairman Jackson from adopting this Federal Field Committee notion where we would not have anything indigenous, right? So Mike Gravel played a key role because he didn't have hangups, any historical hangups, about Native people. He was pragmatic. And of course, Senator Stevens, being a Republican, excuse me, was very effective because, he had the ear of the president. He also had the ear of the rest of the Republican delegation in Congress. And so it just came together. And we were just fortunate that we were able to hang on to that land freeze. And I have an article here written by Bob Zelnick where we had to fight to keep the land freeze when Wally Hickel was nominated. Our ground was shifting out from under us. Eben Hobson, myself, John Borridge, and Evo Nadi were sent to DC to try to preserve the freeze. And we finally did it through working through the Interior Committee, and Senator Jackson secured a commitment from the Secretary Designate that he would not do anything with the freeze without coming to the committee. So that put the onus on the Senate Interior Committee to actually come up with legislation, and they did. And so that's sort of like the story as I recollect it. There are many players and many heroes. And in spite of the fact that one of the biggest items in the bill dropped out somehow, and to this day I don't know how, the whole subsistence provision was dropped out. In spite of that, when we met at APU, when Nixon signed the bill, we all voted for it except Arctic Slope. Mainly because we knew that we sensed that we could never, ever again put together the forces to go get a bill of that magnitude through Congress. And of course, it took us another 10 years, but we did get amendments, with respect to subsistence. And later on, we got amendments with respect to the stock was supposed to become alienable 20 years later. We worked very, very hard through AFN to get a variety of amendments that improved the act. So that's my little commentary. I hope I didn't take too much time, but that's sort of the way I see it. The corporations have done yeoman's work, mothers, housewives, fishermen, hunters, blue-collar workers. They got into the act early on to try to make it work, and I think it's been a tremendous saga. Thank you. Bye.
Me? I can't believe I have to follow you, Wally. Willie, thank you so much. I think you did a marvelous job of putting together a way to think about the way this is thought about. I had in my own mind, not quite sure what the group was today, but I think I can maybe add a couple things that just at least give some thoughts to it that may help. One is I just want to mention, because it's a difference thing that had to do with why I was there to start with. I arrived in Alaska in '67, and within about a year and a half working with the AMU there, I had accomplished myself by getting to know a lot of people on a lot of issues. And when Nick was finally re-elected, or was elected for the first time to be a congressman, he asked me to come and join him and work on this bill. And that was really the main thing that was supposed to happen. And I just want to add one thing about that, because I was probably the one that was closest with Nick than anybody during that period of time, that 2 years that he lived only, to make this happen and get moving. And that is that he decided on his very first day, even before, to become a congressman. He was one of 435 members, one man, to do it. He was in a situation where he really didn't know hardly any of those people, a handful. And he had a mission to try to enact this act, which he tried once in the prior term of Congress, and it didn't work. And it was very clear that there was a lot of reasons and motives to make it work quickly in this Congress. And so I just want to add, so that people understand it, who want to think about this act 50 years ago, that Begich actually decided at the very beginning that he would not be a single congressman who had a strong position on everything that he needed about the bill. He was trying to figure out a situation to create knowledge and balance of it, so that other people can understand what this act should look like, just along the way that you have described one. And of course, as you remember very well being there, I've been in a lot of those meetings with you. People were very unhappy with Nick from time to time because he would not be strong enough about each issue they wanted, whether it was natives, whether it was environmental, whether it was the oil industry or whatever. But what he did is decide to do a balanced situation to do that, and to have other people in the Congress take on certain roles to make it work. And I say that only because it gives you a sense about what happened for one congressman in a huge Congress to put that together. In terms of where it went from that, I want to just mention that I thought about this when I was asked to say something about this 50 years, which is a pretty amazing thing to do, is to try to have some perspective about it over 50 years. I think the second theme, or the main theme that I want to say about that, is that why I have it maybe is the first thing to say, and that is for the years that I came to Alaska, I spent a very remarkable 10 to 15 years. And I started by working a little bit at AMU, then went with baggage. Then when Nick was lost, less than his 2 years, it being his first Congress, Governor Egan, who was at that point a new governor, decided to, a second governor coming back for the second time. He asked me, and John Havelock asked me, if I would help open an office for Alaska here to start representing the state, for the state directly, for TAPS, the pipeline. And I agreed to do that, and we started an office, and that was the first office we had. I did that, it was for about 2 years, and then when that 2 years was done, TAPS had been passed. And I was not sure exactly where to go next. And then, as you remember, Jay Hammond won the new governor over Governor Egan. Remarkable. So I actually thought I lost the job. But after time, Jay and I got to know one another better and better. And he asked me to come up and be the Commissioner of Natural Resources. So I did that, which is the beginning, which occurred when TAPS was constructed. And then in the course of that 2 years out, I was unbelievably in the right scent of politics. Governor Carter was elected as president. And after that president, he asked me to come into the Department of Interior to mainly have a number of things, but to work on one of the things would be the National Conservation Acts for Alaska. So I had to make that choice what to do about that, but I did those things. So at the end of all that, the only reason I mention that is not how great it was for me, but to say that I got to see every one of those bills that came through Alaska, starting with the one you just described for the Settlement Act, but for TAPS, and then for the construction of TAPS, and then years later to the enactment of the National Lands Conservation Act. And as I looked at all of that, and I looked at the things that you just told us about your theory and your thought about how the Settlement Act was taken together, my conclusion is that during that entire period, and I would say it began about the time that the Settlement Act, the Statehood Act was enacted, is that there was a kind of a current that was running in history in Alaska. And that history was one which was, sometimes very, very debated, very difficult, even bitter discussions to work on all those things. And it was a hard thing to do. And you remember very well how difficult it was in the Settlement Act from time to time about how difficult the fights were about it. But in the end, it sorted through along the ways that you just described. And I think that that is a good way to characterize it. And my sense is that current that ran in that was actually one that works in politics, where things are joined on, are changed, and have a lot of information that come in to show one another. But in the end, they do it. And by the time we finally ended up with everything on the Settlement Act, we had people who thought that it should have done more of this and more of that, and other things should be different. But in fact, I conclude after that, and after the things that followed it, they weren't an inventable, but what they were is a place that had a current running in it that changed the way people do things, and that they follow in a normal political contention. And so I just want to say that that's my sense. I don't look at this as if there have been any huge, big problems that changed everything. It was just the work of all the different people working on it over all these years. And so by the time at the end of the day, when we had the national, Alaska National Convention Protection Act, that was an act that had to happen. It was something that had to be done in this country because it was a part of the same thing over a period of time. And so I think now it's just a matter of keeping on to keep it alive and keep solving things. And my final words about all that is a statement that I've had on my own from the very beginning on all of this. And from time to time, I've had a bit different, but it has to do with how we feel and what we can do to make sure we understand fully how well the villages are working and the people in the village are succeeding in a way they're there and doing better things all the way through. I remember finding this one statement that I saw years ago from, I found it in Don Wright's epilogue, which he put in the beginning, where he had a fellow by the name of Chris Wright, who was with the Mental Health in Copper River. And he wrote those things: if you leave the village, you desert your family. If you stay in the village, you desert your future. And that's probably a little over written than I think it probably needs to be. But it seems to me that one of the things that I hope happens over the next decade or the next 50 decades is that the succession of the settlement is one that is working in a much better way each year for all of the people in the village. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Guy, for your perspective. Okay.
What, Weston, can I talk next about President Nixon?
Yes, absolutely.
I just want to take just a few minutes and take it back to President Nixon for a bit. And there were just maybe 3 or 4 quick points to make. Number one, I was a young White House fellow right out of Yale Law School, and I obviously did not know President Nixon very well. But I did get, I think, sufficient glimpses of his thought processes to say with confidence that he also personalized his beliefs. And going back to what Willie said, in this case, that personalization related back to Coach Wallace Newman. And you'd say, you know, why and how? Well, the reality is, again, as Willie said, President Nixon was very close to Coach Newman, almost as close as he was almost like a father to him. And Coach Newman had a profound influence on his life. The president was, quote, on the football team at, at Whittier College, but it's fair to say he spent most of his time sitting on the bench. He was not a great player, but he was a wonderful teammate, and he really, really supported the team. And Coach Newman taught him and inspired him and his teammates to be self-confident, to be competitive, and never to give up. The president felt that Coach Newman had never given up and was proud of his heritage, though he was discriminated against in those days when Native Americans and other minorities simply were not selected. It would be unheard of to be a coach for a major football program or selected for major honors as players. And the president believed that Coach Newman would have been a consensus All-American if it had been a different time, and that he would have been a coach at a Big Ten school if it had been a different time. But that was not possible in those days. He was a Native American. He was a member of the La Jolla Band of Mission Indian tribes in California. So the president said to himself when he became president that if he could right the wrongs of discrimination against Coach Newman, by golly, he was going to do so. And you say, wow, you know, that's how the president made decisions. No, that's not how the president made decisions, but that's how he set the stage in his mind for many things that he viewed are very, very important. Secondly, as you all know, Blue Lake was returned to the Taos Pueblo people 51 years ago, to just 3 days before the 50th anniversary of your land settlement. And we thought about in March and April of 1970, when the president decided to return Blue Lake to the Taos Pueblo people, that we maybe ought to accelerate and force some decisions on the Alaska Native Land Claims Settlement Act. And we decided not to do that. We decided to separate it out and take it out of the president's Indian message of July 8th, 1970, because of its complexity and its sensitivity. And we didn't think it was yet ready for prime time. So that when we did the president's message on Blue Lake, and a reaffirmation and a total change of the approach of the United States to Native American policy by promoting a philosophy of self-determination and economic development where the tribes could control their own resources. And obviously Alaska Native Land Claims came very much into that. About that same time, a little thing called the Vietnam War was in its great height and heyday, and there was the Cambodian invasion. There was our invasion of Cambodia, Wally Hickle's reaction to that, and the president firing Wally Hickle. So Wally Hickle was gone. And that meant that the focus and attention on Alaska Native Land Claims really had a risk of also going down, not down the tubes, but certainly going out of everybody's main focus and importance. But the president felt very strongly about two things. Number one, he wanted a decision, and he wanted a decision to be fair and to be equitable, and most importantly, to be consistent with his philosophy of self-determination and economic development and the control of the Indian community of its own resources. And he so instructed Roger Morton. And secondly, he had somebody who we haven't mentioned today that we need to mention, a wonderful man named Brad Patterson, who Willie knew very well. And Brad Patterson worked for Len Garman, who was counselor to the president. And Brad just put his heart and his soul, he's now deceased, they put his heart and his soul and spent close to that next year doing nothing but trying to force through focus and attention on the part of the White House to a land settlement in Alaska. And when you actually turn around and look at who, and as an aside, I will say that Willie and I are probably the only two people from that time in the White House who are still alive. I mean, I was the baby. I was 24 years old right at Yale Law School. And Willie was a little older, but not that much older. But so a lot of the perspective comes back down, I guess, just the two of us who are left. But I really give credit to both the president and to John Ehrlichman on this issue. from the White House perspective. John Ehrlichman controlled access to the president on this issue, and he simply reported on what the president's decision was. And no cabinet member challenged Ehrlichman's conclusion, including Roger Morton. And in the spring of 1971, just before I left the White House, and so I wasn't there when actually the bill passed or the president signed it. But in the spring of 1971, Ehrlichman said, okay, it is decision time now. And he called into his office himself, Brad Patterson, Len Garment, Secretary Morton, Secretary Schultz, who at that point in time was director of the Office of Management and Budget, Don Rice, who was an assistant director of the Office of Management and Budget, myself, and John Whitaker. John Whitaker, interestingly enough, was a geologist of all things, but he was a deputy director of the Domestic Policy Council. And the way the White House worked, it was very top-down decision-making, so that Wally Hickel, when he was there, and then Roger Morton, when he was there, reported to John Whitaker if they wanted to get something in front of the president. John Whitaker reported to John Ehrlichman, and John Ehrlichman brought it to the president. And sometimes the president got deeply involved with decision papers, et cetera, et cetera. Other times he called a meeting with just John, and he said, let's decide this, and let's decide this now. And so the president wanted the issues to be resolved, and he wanted to be resolved based on two principles. As I said, number one, it had to be fair, it had to be equitable, and it had to be consistent with his new policy of self-determination for Native Americans. And two, he wanted to get that pipeline going. That was very important, both to the economy of the United States and for our national security. So there was a duality there. And he simply said to John, I'm not going to wait any longer. And so John held this meeting sitting in his second floor West Wing office, and he stressed that, again, the president wanted a fair settlement of both land and money, and he wanted a strong component to be economic development, and that had to be consistent with his Indian message. Schultz, Secretary Schultz at that point in time, asked John what the president thought was equitable and passable. And John said, 44 million acres of land, almost $1 billion in cash, and creation of the 12 regional corporations, the 200 or so village corporations, and then eventually the 13th regional corporation. And along with that, he said, and we have to get the pipeline moving. It is time and we have to do it. And no one in that meeting with the president, no one, well, I'm back a second. No one had been in that meeting with the president other than John. And no one with John knew, therefore, what the president actually said. Roger Morton was not pleased. He was the new Secretary of Interior. He was not pleased, to say the least. But for whatever reason, he decided not to challenge John and said, if that's what the president wants, that's what it will be. Let's get on with it now. And that, again, was very consistent with how the Domestic Policy Council worked. Roger worked through John Whitaker, who reported to John Ehrlichman, who reported to the president, and where the two frequently made decisions without cabinet level meetings if they thought something had been thoroughly vetted in another way and it was unnecessary. It was a very top-down decision-making process. I had the good fortune to be had specific responsibility for Native American policy, and that straddled a number of departments, not simply the Interior Department. It straddled the Justice Department. It straddled the Department of Health and Education, what was then called HEW, Health, Education, and Welfare. And because of that, I had a flexibility to weigh in and to kind of wander around. And I must stress that I was really peripheral to this. The people who made it happen within the White House were Brad Patterson and John Ehrlichman. And once I left the White House in June of 1971, it continued on. There were some changes, but basically the elements were set in that meeting in the spring, and the president signed the legislation in December 18th of 1971. So sometimes things that are very complex and go on for years and years and years and years, all of a sudden just get to an inflection point where you got to fish or cut bait and you got to make a decision. And Richard Nixon could be very definitive, very firm, and very comfortable in his own skin when he made a decision, and he decided it was time. I was going to decide it. This is what it was going to be. I didn't need a lot of cabinet meetings to convince me of that. I'd seen the documents, I'd seen the papers, and I was going to make a decision, and he did. So that's my 2 cents.
That's tremendous. That is a great description. And I'm so pleased that you're here to give that story, because like you say, you're the last one standing, and it's a great saga. And thank you so much for those details, because it really is a key part of our history here in Alaska and in the indigenous community, and our people need to know that. And I really appreciate you joining us and giving that story.
Thank you.
As we say, Kuyanna. Thank you. All right, it's terrific. All right, and in the meantime, the Ted Stevens Foundation has been busily sending someone about telling the land claim story, and they have, this is like I think the world's premiere of the work that Corinna and her group has done. Corinna?
So I first wanted to thank the panelists, because these are stories that I had not heard yet. And that's why I think these anniversaries are so important, particularly for later generations, is to hear what happened behind the scenes, because it can help inform when we see what's going on in the world today. How do we solve the issues of today, right? And understanding how they did it in the past can help inform what we do today. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time, and to UAA and Willie for hosting this event. As Willie said, it is the world premiere. The foundation is the repository of the Ted Stevens collection of papers. And when we were looking for opportunities to share that, we thought it would be a good time to put together a video documentary. The most important lesson, I think, from the ANCSA legislation is how, despite enormous obstacles, the first people of Alaska came together and were able to coalesce with a single voice, sometimes several voices, but generally with a single voice, to help accomplish something that had not been accomplished in the United States up until that time, and totally transform the relationship of the federal government with our nation's tribes and Alaska Natives. So without further ado, if we want to play the video.
In the White House, President Eisenhower signs the proclamation that makes Alaska's entry into the Union official.
This frozen land of desolation, twice the size of Texas, has since developed into a source of fabulous wealth.
And in 1959, when Alaska became a state, the Statehood Act authorized the state to select 104 million acres without compensation. Once the state began its selection process, it became painful and clear that Alaska Native people would be affected.
I think that people had better wake up to the fact that this is a very critical year for Alaska, as far as I'm concerned.
Our relationships are friendly, but there are many economic problems and social problems that do need to be settled.
Well, ANCSA, as it's commonly known, is our land claim settlement that the Alaska Natives pushed for between 1966 and 1971. Very concentrated period. It was the culmination of about 100-year phase in which the United States never came to grips with the question of actually who owned Alaska, because of the Statehood Act authorizing the new state to select over 100 million acres of our land. Of course, it precipitated a crisis for Alaska Natives who we felt Alaska belonged to us.
Alaska Natives were never conquered. Their land had never been touched by Russians. They couldn't comprehend, one, the concept of private ownership of land, and secondly, how people they never met could have sold their land to the United States.
They make laws, they don't tell us anything about it, and say this is the new law now. So we started shaking our fists at them. I mean, we weren't getting along with anybody. We just said, you gotta treat us fair. We're humans just like you, except these are our ways.
During that period of time after statehood in 1958 and before the settlement bill, Native Alaskans were coming into conflict with the government in nearly every region. The communities were disjointed like they'd always been, but a confluence of events was starting to take shape that would change all of it. One of the driving factors that started it all was the Rampart Dam.
Of course, as you know, we're trying to develop low-cost power through building the dam at Rampart on the Yukon, the largest man-made lake in the world. It will be 10% bigger than Lake Erie.
It's utterly mind-blowing to think that that was once a plan for our interior region, for our Yukon River. It would have destroyed everything. It would have destroyed our subsistence way of life. It would have destroyed our villages. It's completely inconceivable to me that the government would even have considered this.
They'd be Ernest Gruning and a movement within in the United States to build the largest lake in the world, and the Rampart Dam. And it was supposedly for energy, and I'm a great supporter of hydropower, always have been, but I got very irritated about the idea that they were going to dam and flood the valley. You had a lake with 15 million acres, the biggest lake, I say, ever created by man in the world.
The lake created by the dam would have flooded 9 separate villages in the region.
Just flooded them, including mine. And I went to bat, and we fought this thing back and forth. I was actually looked down upon by Ed Tucson and a few other people that were in the business of owning property in Fort Yukon. But I said, this is wrong. And that did sort of solidify those villages into an idea that here was an outside source and force trying to flood them without any input. Well, the comment from the government was, well, we'll move you. Sounded like China. Well, that was not what we wanted. And we did win by a fluke, in a sense, because the Vietnam War started. And the money for that dam went to the war, so we didn't build a dam. Best things ever happened on the Vietnam War, by the way.
And while a war likely ended the Rampart Dam project for the interior, the vestiges of another war created a different problem for the people of the North.
Project Chariot, we're going to use nuclear power to create a harbor. That was the whole idea.
Created in seconds with the tremendous energy of the peaceful atom.
The controversial project was proposed here at Cape Thompson, near Tikigap, Point Hope, by Edward Teller.
The importance of a scientific discovery is not measured by its consequences.
The father of the atomic bomb.
Should the scientists make a distinction between destructive and constructive application?
The answer is no.
Point Hope, one of the oldest continuously occupied communities in North America, was facing a forced abandonment if the project went through.
They laid a whole series of nuclear bombs underwater or under the ground, and then they would set them off, and it would raise the land up and it would sink, and they'd have a harbor. It wasn't a new idea. They did have one out of Amchitka. They had a test out of Amchitka.
The explosion's radioactive fallout is almost as dangerous as the blast itself.
Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And in response to the nuclear project, a young man from Point Hope, Howard Rock, stepped up and created what would become a key weapon in the upcoming battle for settlement.
The 100 times cannot be underscored as such a pivotal part of the ANCSA movement and part of the movement overall during the 60s and 70s. For the first time, the Tundra Times newspaper gave Natives a voice. My mom joined the board of the Tundra Times in the early days with the great Inupiat leader Howard Rock, who she became very good friends with.
Yeah, he was one of ours. He was, from Point Hope. He was a whaler and became a masterful writer.
Howard used the newly formed paper to bring attention to Project Chariot and helped to rally enough interest to stop the project.
It unified us in several huge causes. It gave voice to opposition to the nuclear Project Chariot and the Rampart Dam, which would have destroyed our Koyukon Athabascan ancestral lands that my elders had lived on for generations.
And in the same way the Rampart Dam helped interior Alaska Native villages band together, Project Chariot brought together the North Slope.
The Tundra Times was a reliable vehicle, even though it had just a small circulation. But the politicians read it and government officials read it.
Alaska Natives from around the state were coming together regionally and organizing. At the same time, the state of Alaska was trying to select the lands that they were promised by Congress in the Statehood Act.
And the Alaska State Legislature was selecting 103 million acres. The first place they picked was Prudhoe Bay. So whoa. And said, wait a minute. Let's not do that.
And the idea was that we were at a stalemate in the state of Alaska for the Trans-Alaskan Pipeline. There was a lawsuit filed by the village of Stevens Village. Then there was actually a logjam, and a group of Alaska Natives got together and said, this is the time to act on trying to acquire some of our Aboriginal lands.
In 1966, a Koyukon Athabascan man named Emil Nadi sent out a letter to a handful of Alaska Native leaders seeking a unified front.
I still have my invite from Emil Nadi with his little note saying, come on down a day or two earlier if you can. But, he thought he was inviting maybe a dozen people or so, because we weren't that many of us, right, back getting active at that time. But I think everybody began to sense the impending catastrophe of the loss of our lands, because there had been news about villages whose lands were being selected by the state, particularly between here and Fairbanks in the rail belt area. And so instead of having just a small number of people, maybe there might, Emil says 300, but it was a small room, above a fur shop, the audio cam building downtown. Maybe there were 200 at the most, maybe.
And the convention came together in early 1967. It was funded primarily by the Tyonic people who had just gotten a $17 million settlement from the federal government for oil and gas leases.
During the formation, or talking about the formation and how AFN was going to come and who was going to be involved, some of the northern regions did not want Tlingit and Haida involved in the land claims at all, because they felt that the Tlingit and Haida lawsuit had settled the land or settled our claim, which it did not. It was just a financial settlement.
They had their own Claims Act settlement, and it didn't make very much. It was through Court of Claims.
They had laid claim, I think in 1929, saying the feds had taken away their timberland, and they had gotten a fairly significant settlement. So socially, by the standards of society, the metropolitan standards of society, their folks had gone to college, were used to dealing in commerce, were about a generation ahead in the world of commerce.
Tlingit Haida Central Council had been formed. The Alaska Native Brotherhood had been involved for several generations.
It was kind of an ill feeling that you're sitting there and you're negotiating and you're talking about the Claims Act in this totality, but the Tlinkits had two bites of the apple.
Even though they had given clinking height of money. That didn't satisfy us. We had to have land.
The Court of Claims was a dead ender. I mean, you spent years, I mean, you had to get a congressional resolution to sue the government. That takes time and money. And then they spent 35 years trying to get a measly $7.5 million and no land. I mean, that was our option, right? If we didn't get legislation, they're going to kick us off to this old Court of Claims, Indian Claims Commission setup, which was a total loser. You get pennies an acre and no land.
Arguments for and against the participation was emotional, sometimes heated. When went to a vote, the 25-member board split 12 to 12. I cast a tie-breaking vote. That brought in Clinton Haida with us to join AFN. We needed their experience, we needed their knowledge, we needed their support, and what we were trying to do went beyond Indian law. It went directly to Congress, bypassed the courts. We needed you.
Emerging from that was a unified concept. The Alaska First People had a claim to a substantial portion of Alaska and a substantial amount of money.
For the first time, the Alaska Native population had solidified into a singular vote.
And our starting position really was, okay, Uncle Sam, you've taken X amount of lands already in various national forest lands or petroleum reserves or whatever. We want the Court of Claims to decide which lands have been taken, and we want payment for those lands. And all the other lands we want back, right? That was our starting position. Of course, we understood that, this was an impossible proposition, but that's where we started.
Lands from around the state, one by one, were being claimed en masse by regional Native associations.
In fact, the natives of Alaska now claim over 90%, almost all of Alaska. Now, we can't spend all our time in the next 40 to 50 years litigating these claims, trying to get them decided through the courts.
While different Native groups had been claiming land for more than 30 years, this became a tsunami. And in its wake,
this, of course, precipitated a crisis for Alaska as a state, because the Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, thankfully decided that maybe as trustee for native lands that maybe he should not permit the state to have their interim conveyances, and that became known as the land freeze. And that land freeze was absolutely critical in the end, in my opinion, to getting Congress to act on a piece of legislation.
The land rights of the Alaska Natives have never been defined. This has always been put off. And they're going to get the shaft, they said, because the state now wants to pick some of the land that they've been living on and so on. And I said, well, how can I stop it? And they said, you can write a piece of paper that says Alaska can't select any more land until the Indian land rights are decided.
It was a misuse of power. But out of it, I think we probably achieved more ownership of land than we would have done before, because we really got our backs up. So, I thought it was wrong at the time. I still think what's happened to the state is wrong, let alone the Native corporations, in the sense that we had a right to 103 million acres of land as a state of our choosing that was not reserved at that time.
After Udall's land freeze in 1966, the whole state, which was economically hanging on by a thread, was paying attention. But sooner than anyone expected, the entire country started watching the young state very closely as well.
In the spring of 1968, a vast oil discovery was discovered in Prudhoe Bay.
In 1968, at Prudhoe Bay, the largest pool of oil on the North American continent was discovered.
Alaska would have gone from a beggar state to a very rich state if the pipeline was built. My first year in Alaska, 1965, the big debate was whether Alaska was going to exceed $100 million on its budget.
Alaska's at a standstill. Our hands are tied. Until this problem is settled, there can be no meaningful development, no economic development in Alaska. The pipeline, our Alaska pipeline, is just one of the projects we very desperately need. And we've all been told by the pipeline company that the pipeline is not going to move 1 inch until this settlement is made.
It all sort of came into high gear, you know, with the discovery of Prudhoe Bay in 1968.
The industry all had to say a lot to do with it too. You know, I mean, they had big money. And they had a lot of influence in Congress.
All of a sudden, you know, it amped up the issue of who owns Alaska, because the country needed the oil. Alaska was on its sort of last leg, so to speak. It was barely surviving because it didn't have enough revenue. And so all of a sudden, here was a potential source to allow Alaska to exist as a state. I have to compliment Wally Hickel in retrospect, because he was the first elected official to support the 40 million acres.
Governor Hickel created the Land Claims Task Force in 1968 to try and get the state on board with a plan to which the Alaska Native community would agree.
Wally was, you know, pragmatic. I mean, don't get me wrong. We fought him tooth and tongue because he was trying to kill the land claims, the land freeze, because it was having a financial impact on the state.
I can say this, I believe Wally Hickel was really pushing this because he wanted to get the pipeline built.
And we had a very tight time frame to come up with recommendations to give to Governor Hickel and the state, but we methodically went through all the issues.
The set of recommendations that came out of the task force in 1969 became a pivotal reference point and symbolized cooperation between the two groups. It included giving the Alaska Natives 40 million acres of land and regional corporations. And that was all happening while Senator Ernest Greening, who lost in the primary, was trying to hold on to the seat through a write-in.
And write in Greening, or use a sticker. You'll be glad you did. Stick with Greening. He can do more for Alaska.
Against him, former Speaker of the Alaska House, Mike Gravel.
These people have to regain their birthright. I think one of the ways that they're going to do it, I think the Native people will do it through their land claims.
Senator Gravel beat Senator Greening in a primary, primarily by promising the Alaska Native community that he would introduce legislation.
But 1968 was a crazy year in Alaska's political history, and right before Gravel took office, Senator Bob Bartlett died, and that allowed Governor Hickel to pick his replacement.
Ted Stevens was appointed after Senator Bartlett died, and Stevens was actually the senior senator because he was sworn in before Gravel.
You know, I was 10 years old when my father went to the Senate. The Settlement Claims Act really was right out of the chute when my father went to Congress in 1968, late 68, early 69.
On the national stage, in entered newly elected President Richard Nixon.
Greatness comes in simple trappings.
Stevens had been solicitor of the Department of the Interior, and Hickel recommended him to President Nixon to be Secretary of the Interior. Nixon didn't like Stevens because Stevens was too liberal, so he asked Hickel to take the job.
When he was nominated to be secretary, it was a shock to us because we knew that his idea was to go to Washington, get rid of that land freeze, and build that pipeline in order to save Alaska.
Stevens was known for his outspoken temper, and during the Hickel confirmation hearings, he was yelling at witnesses, screaming at people. And one day, Scoop Jackson came into the office, and Stevens and I, since he was so low-ranking, we actually shared an office. We're sitting there, and Jackson said, "Calm down. You and I are going to have a great future together. We're going to get your guy confirmed. We're going to settle Alaska Native claims. But the first thing I want you to do," and he handed him a card, "is go to my tailor and get some suits so you can look like a senator." That was the beginning of a lifelong friendship.
Really, in the end, it's about relationships, and the relationship that the Alaskan Natives developed with the leaders, i.e. Henry Jackson, Scoop Jackson, And the relationship that my dad had with Scoop Jackson, I think people forget about that relationship and the importance of that. But Scoop Jackson was one of the leaders in the U.S. Senate in the 50s that fought for statehood.
Senator Stevens' close friendship with Scoop Jackson turned out to be one of the key ingredients for Alaska in the fight for land claims.
And people forget that, he went into the U.S. Senate when there was 34 Republicans.
Back then, people knew they had to give and take. It was a better atmosphere, I think, back then, and people agreed to disagree, or they sat down and talked about it and worked out some agreements.
He really expanded, and he brought people to Washington, D.C. He encouraged Alaska leaders to come down and to establish individual personal relationships with the decision makers.
Throughout the battle for land claims, Senator Stevens was known as a great facilitator who loved inviting people into his home to talk through ideas around a dinner table.
Oh, all the time. My dad would call up, hey, we got this guy coming. The next thing you know, 18 people would show up for dinner. My mom just wouldn't bat an eye, send us to the store, go buy Frito pie, it doesn't matter what we serve. But it was different back then. People, and besides that, they're Alaskans. Alaskans don't care. And like I said, it was to witness, a lot of heated discussions, a lot of people talking back and forth, a lot of different factions. But it was, people working it out. And it wasn't just 1 year. It wasn't just one event. It was continuous.
Meanwhile, inside the Capitol, the team was forming to help address land claims.
On the Senate side, it came down to Senator Jackson, Senator Stevens, Bill Van Ness, myself, Gravel's guy, Mike Rowan, to do the initial drafting on this.
There is no way to do it so that everybody can be happy. There's no way to do it other than to just get the best possible compromise we can and to get the deal made so that it will be a good deal for all Alaskans, natives and non-natives alike.
Gravel, as his first act in the Senate, introduced a bill to give Alaska Natives $100 million and 10 million acres of land in fee simple. The ranking member on the Interior Committee, Clinton Anderson of New Mexico, said, over my dead body.
The initial version of the compromise put out by the Senate in the 91st Congress was not well received by many in the Senate or Alaska Natives.
The Federal Field Committee recommendation that was contracted by the chairman of the Senate committee, Senator Jackson, their idea was basically to end up with no indigenous institution at all. They were going to issue stock. In 10 years, it was going to go public. We would have no village corporations, no regional corporation. And then on the other side, on the federal side, as much as we love Udall, his idea was old school, right? Reservations, types land, a small, his idea of a generous settlement was like $180 million.
They wanted to give us $100 million. They wanted to give us $10 million. They wanted to give nothing. And a little bit of land. Some of their proposals were like 10 million acres and $100,000. No.
The bill passed the Senate and died in the House. By the end of that session, with no one happy and no compromise made, Stevens, who tried to make inroads through compromise, started vocalizing more openly a different approach.
Stevens told me that he wanted two things. He said, I want justice done for the Alaska Native community, but primarily, in addition to getting justice for the Alaska people, I want to get every goddamn acre I can away from the federal government and into private ownership.
Alaska today is 95% federal land. And if you really want to look at the bill that way, it frees our state land selections so that if it gives anybody anything, it's giving the state the 103.5 million acres we got at statehood. The state land selections are my primary goal in working on this land claims bill, along with justice for our Native people.
The reaction of the business community, particularly in Anchorage, was very negative.
That was a hard thing because there was, like I say, a lot of people in Alaska didn't think anybody, the Aboriginals, should get any more than they've got. And the problem I had, and Ted finally convinced him, this is literally taking the land away from the federal government for the guys in New York and California. And the only thing of regrets I have, we did get 100 million acres of land. You know, it's better in the natives' hands than it is in the agency's hands.
Ted was receiving pushback on the idea from Wally Hickle's replacement, Governor Keith Miller, who had sided with the Anchorage business community. But luckily enough for land claims, the governor's race back home ended up seeing the political end of both Keith Miller's time in the governor's mansion, as well as Howard Pollock's tenure as Alaska's lone representative.
So it wasn't until Begich replaced Pollock that you had a Democrat in the House who could work well with Aspinall. And Begich was a terrific congressman.
And Aspen was a crusty, difficult guy, and he had a feeling about what this settlement should be was a lot less generous than what we ultimately agreed that it should be. They were going to control the native settlement team no matter what. They were not going to let it go by without them dealing with every word of it.
Nick Begich's entrance after the 1970 election finally opened up the possibility of passing a bill. Because, just like the position of Scoop Jackson in the Senate, Congressman Wayne Aspinall could kill the whole deal at any time.
That he controlled a lot of that bill. And we did, in a sense, did too, because, I mean, really Nick's job and my job was to do the best we could to work on that. And he wouldn't deal with everybody.
With Congressman Aspinall on board, the final roadblock to a conference committee and reconciling the differences between the two bills was gone. And thanks to a push from the Nixon administration, the Alaska Native people finally had a bill that included the 40 million acres that was originally agreed to by Hickle and continually pushed by Senator Stevens.
We all basically understood that we would probably never get the forces together again to get something as complex and in the context of American Indians as generous as this one. So we took a chance and we took it and have been running with it for 50 years.
Whether it'll ever happen again, I don't know. But you're going to find out in the long run is probably more important to the state, this act itself, the statehood itself, as far as generating an economy and as far as, you know, the whole concept.
When you look back and you think about, again, this very novel concept, this is not anything close to the settlements, the treaties in the lower 48 with assigned reservation status. This was about a level of economic empowerment that was kind of a novel vision.
We were at an AFN meeting in Anchorage when we got the call that the president had signed it. That was very exciting. I remember jumping up and, with everybody else and hollering and clapping and how happy we all were. So that was 50 years ago. I can't believe it.
Ted was a very forceful senator, very good person, know him well, and he believed in it. That's one thing that I was proud. If you go back and read the records, his speeches, his comments, his dedication to it convinced Alaska he was right.
None of us knew how to run a business. When you had to be a businessman, the most impressive thing was you carry a briefcase. There was not a briefcase in town you could buy. You open them up, pair of mucklucks, some dried fish. There was no paperwork in them. Even if it was the last dime they'd buy a briefcase, carry it along. And I'm a businessman,
Right. Corinna, awesome. That's great.
Thank you.
there was a lot more interviews we wanted to get, but in the time frame we weren't able to. And now I know there's a few more like Bobby that we can reach out to.
Anytime.
Awesome, just awesome. You did a great job on that. I'm so happy that you took on that project.
Yeah, we really have to thank Cale Green, did a remarkable job filming this for us. So thank you.
Right. So do you have a plan for showing it intergalactically?
So we're going to be posting it on our website, and we're currently discussing with KTOO to show it statewide in January. They're a little booked up. They have a lot of ANCSA videos running right now, but we're working with them. So hopefully we can show it statewide January 9th.
Yes.
We're looking at a few dates, but.
Perfect. I'm glad you brought in those historical events that a lot of Alaskans don't know about. Our own people don't know about. That is the Rampart Dam idea was just, unbelievably. I mean, they had no users for the power, for God's sake. And the project, the nuclear project itself was also another harebrained scheme that could have come off if Point Hope and people from the university who, some of them got fired actually, didn't take on the project. But it did galvanize our people and actually bring up the question of land as well. So Cleanna, thank you very much. I think that's, I think you have an announcement to make, Corinne?
So in honor of the 50th anniversary of ANCSA, as I mentioned earlier, the Ted Stevens Foundation is the repository for the Ted Stevens collection, which is all of his documents and records. So memorandum, letters, video, photographs from over 40 years of his career. We're still in the process of archiving and curating that, but we have completed the ANCSA collection, and we are donating that to the University of Alaska Anchorage's Consortium Library. So that will be open and available to the public sometime early January. But our hope is this is just a starting point for the donation of the entire Stevens collection and the eventual creation of an Alaska Leaders Archive. Because as ANCSA has taught us, there's no one Alaskan leader who has shaped our state. It has always been a collective effort. So what we want to do with the university, with an Alaska Leaders Archive, is make sure that we have a place that Alaskans can go to understand their history, to help inform their decisions going forward. So we're very excited to work with Chancellor Parnell and Steve Rollins and the entire University of Alaska leadership team to make this a reality. So we thank everyone for participating today. Thank you, Willie, for moderating and hosting. And thank you to Guy and Bobby for joining us from the East Coast. It was really illuminating. As an Alaskan who's raising the next generation of Alaskans, these stories are really important to share and tell. So I really thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Well, yes, thank you again. And also for just the wide range of people that you talked to. Because you're right, there are some unsung heroes out there, and I'm glad that for your announcement, because I love history, and I'm hoping that our schools do a better job of conveying the exciting cultures, the exciting history of Alaska. It's been a great saga, and I think your donation of materials will be real helpful to have students have access to them, and maybe others who have materials, be willing to share them as well. So thank you, Chancellor. Thank you, Weston and staff, for bringing us together. It was a wonderful event, and I appreciate Bobby, your participation and the details that you remember so well, and also Guy for your participation as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks much, Willie.
Take care. Happy holidays.
Stay well.
Oh, yep.